the biggest percent change in that time period was that people were feeling more lazy, so, and that increased by like almost 31%. So I guess if they're trying to point out the complexities of identity, specifically racial identity in the U.S. school system, that drives home the importance of addressing inequalities between races and school systems. Yeah. But yeah.
Okay. My section kind of picks up where yours left off. I guess that's how all of them work. But yeah, it ended with the chart that you were talking about and then goes on to talk about immigration some more. So I thought it was interesting that it was saying that like the minorities, and it used that in quotes, are actually becoming a majority, like as we like progress as a society, and like the birth rates and the immigration rates and things that weren't so much an issue in like the 70s are now becoming a thing, because like multicultural education has to be a thing now, because we have students of so many different races and ethnicities and backgrounds and identities that like it's impossible to not teach multiculturalism. But it also talked in my section about a lot of backlash that they get from that. So I thought it was a really interesting section to read. Another thing that it said was Latinos are the most segregated of all ethnicities at this current moment, which like you don't really think about until like you read it and then you're like, oh wait, yeah, that makes sense. Like students are forced to speak English in classrooms, and ELL is not as good as it should be at this point in time, and like we could definitely do a lot to improve teaching Hispanic and non-Hispanic students, and like making that a more equal opportunity for all students. It also talked about the poverty line and how most, like it said like more than 50% of the United States children live in some degree of poverty, which is crazy, but I guess like that is how it is. Like the whole 99% versus the 1% is kind of a reality, and we can't just ignore that a lot of students are coming to school without proper food or proper daycares before they go to kindergarten, or anything that teaches them or prepares them for kindergarten, while other students are given these like super preppy like preschools that teach them how to read in the alphabet before they're like 3 years old. Like not all students are starting kindergarten at the same level, and that means kids in private schools as well as in public schools. And that's kind of a shame, but it is the reality in which we live in. So multiculturalism is becoming more and more important, because you have to recognize that students are coming from different backgrounds, and that if you're teaching in a public school or in a charter school or in any setting, you have to be able to speak to the students and meet them where they're at, and then bring that along with them, so that way they can individualize the lesson plan to themselves, as well as like make it about themselves and make it something they want to learn. So one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting under the examining political struggles, the multicultural education backlash and legislation, was that like so much backlash has come about just from people saying like we should have multicultural education. People are like, no, we need to go back to the basics, or this is like a political uproar, or all this really crazy kind of stuff. So in the back to basics argument, they're saying like we need to go back to basically like white education. They didn't say it that way, but that's basically what it is. It's like we need to teach the basic education that we've always taught. But that was before we realized that like there are people that have voices that are not just white people. And it's kind of disgusting reading this section. Especially the part where they mention E.D. Hirsch's 1987 book that he wrote called Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know. And it basically was just like Eurocentric, and that said that multiculturalism is a threat and all of this nonsense. And he was backlashed by Eugene Prevesno, who said cultural literacy, what every American ought to know. And his is much more multiculturalist and speaks about how you can't just have a Eurocentric view of the world. That's not how life works, and that's not the reality of the world we live in. And then he also talked about the eroding the traditional education canon. And this was saying that like people are saying that there's going to be this like us versus them mentality, which is kind of disgusting. But at the same time, I realized like that's how I was raised. Like I went to a very white school. I went to Catholic school my entire life until college. And I think there was one African American person in my entire class, and she was one of two African American people in the entire school, the other one being her sister. And when we talked about like the slavery section of American history, it became like so uncomfortable for her that she had to leave the classroom because people were so insensitive. And it was like absolutely disgusting, but it was very much like, oh, well, it's their problem, not ours. And I was like, that's disgusting. We cannot talk to students of any race or any ethnicity about that without it being our problem. Like, what happened in America is our problem. We all have the same history, even though we come from different backgrounds. Which is kind of like what it talked about. It also said that like people think that teaching multiculturalism will lead to an overthrow in the United States government, which I think is ridiculous. And like I wrote in my notes, like, what? Like that's just weird. People need to calm down. And finally, it talked about the political struggles of legislation and policy, and it started talking about No Child Left Behind, which we all know was a great success. That is incredibly sarcastic. But it like focused so much on public education and just teaching or testing students on reading and math that it ignored all of the other subjects, and is so damaging in so many levels because like you can't just test people on things and expect them to learn if you're only teaching them how to take a test at the end of the year. And then my section ended with the talk of the blueprint for reform that Obama started in 2010, and I think that's where you're going to pick up.
Yeah, so I read back a little into your section and then kept going. It was really interesting as a sociology major to reread a bunch of the stuff that I learned about in my undergrad, especially reading about Arizona and how, again, how they got rid of their ethnic studies. As someone with an ethnic studies degree, that blows my mind because that was like all I wanted to learn about in school. But then it went in to talk about Obama, like you said, the blueprint and how that it was like a promise to get more state level and like district level control back instead of federal, because No Child Left Behind was one of the biggest school system. And then it talked about the conveyors of the Forum for Education and Democracy had 5 assumptions they believed we should be working under. And number 1 was equity. There was teaching, culture, evidence, and community. And then it just talks about educational inequality and how it's been a fact for many children. And it's been a reality, and a lot of people try to ignore that fact. Actually not. So then it went on to talk about some more competitive grants to encourage and reward states for creating conditions for education innovation. And it tapped into resources made available through the Education Recovery Act, but they were still concerned that it was on standardized testing. I personally hate standardized testing. I have read a lot of articles and a lot of different research projects about how ineffective it actually is and the issues behind it. So that really touched with me. And then it talked about teachers and teaching to test method and this huge movement where teachers are being forced, and so are administrators, to just pretty much put their school into a situation where they're literally teaching only what's going to be on a standardized test. And it's pulling away from physical education, the arts, and all these other sciences, social studies, all these different places that aren't like math or reading that's going to be on this test, and all the issues with that. And it talked about how some schools, yes, they have raised their test scores because of that. It's just caused a lot more issues than it seems to be worth, especially because low standardized testing scores are really detrimental to students. And it's been proven that students who test low on standardized testing as a young student, and they know that they've tested low because they compare your scores to a average, they're more likely to not be interested in school any longer and not actually reach their full potential because they've been so scarred by this test scoring. Personally, I had that experience. I really, really resonated with this. I almost dropped out of school because of test scores. Lo and behold, now I'm getting my master's. So if I had, maybe not taken that test and not have taken it this long to get there. So I really like that section. And then I talked about Common Core and how they conducted an international analysis of policies related to curriculum and standards, and how they taught testing results. The highest standards actually came from schools that focus on a lot of subjects that the U.S. ignores. And there's been this huge, result, but still nothing has changed. We're still focusing on these two subjects and not taking the time to really go into a more broad kind of studying that allows students to learn a little better. Then it talked about teachers and their responsibilities in the No Child Left Behind, and how there's been a lot of issues for teachers because they're forced to have these standards, and a lot of times they don't get to go outside and do projects outside of the curriculum that they're given that they have to stick to, and it causes them to feel like they have lost their professionalism and that they don't have as much teaching responsibility and aren't doing as much as a teacher to impact lives that they wanted to. And then they talked about a few different theories, standards-driven versus standard-conscious curriculums, and the differences between those two, how a standard-driven begins with standards and draws the big ideas from them for further design, while standard-conscious uses standards as a tool rather than starting point. And then many books now are challenging the notion of that standards will necessarily lead to standardization. They're saying that, it's not working as well as everyone thought. So there's been a lot of theories and stuff that are coming out of this to try to change. And so then from there, it went into talking more about the methodology of the research they've conducted. So they talked about how this text is going to be a lot of case studies, various snapshots, ethnographic case studies. It's a macro representation. It's looking at various backgrounds, identities, communities, all that, and it's mostly ages 13 to 19. But that because it's a case studies and snapshots are not actual samples, it's no case study of a single individual can adequately or legitimately portray the complex of an entire group. So this text is not saying that you should necessarily look at this as if it's like written law, but more it's supposed to prompt you to ask on your own. And don't make assumptions about your students and the backgrounds they come from or the situations they're in. You just need to ask questions and have an open dialogue, and that it can take away a lot of the issues. And then the end of my section was just a conclusion. It wrapped up everything that the section had touched on. It says that the top 5 points that they wanted to make was clarifying the goals and key terms, dissolving myths about immigration and difference, naming the social, economic, political, and ideological underpinnings of educational structure, studying the current demographic mosaic of our nation, and examining the of legislation and policy. So that's where I ended.
Awesome. Do we want to have a discussion on this chapter first and then move on to the other 2 pieces?
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
One of the things I liked the most about this chapter was the use of the word mosaic in the conclusion that I know you just talked about, Camille, because instead of saying the melting pot or the hodgepodge or all the words that you always hear all the time, it is more of a mosaic. Like, it's people with their own individual cultures that aren't going to like assimilate into other people's cultures. Like, they should adopt their culture to, actually I wouldn't even use the word adopt. They would bring their culture with them when they come to this country, and then it's important to recognize and to include in education because they're people and we should treat them as that. And like, their cultures matter.
Earlier in the chapter, it was talking about how American history is not just every aspect. It's every single identity and every single
Yeah, it's important to recognize that, like, you can't just look at one group of people at any given time. Like, even when you talk about, like, the Civil Rights Act, you can't just look at one demographic of people at that time because it affected every single person in this country.
Yeah. A part of this section or this chapter that really resonated with me was the parts about immigration. Because I grew up in a predominantly white school, but my last name is Sanchez, so there was like not a lot of Hispanic students and like students of color at all. So people would always say, like, I don't know, just like kind of derogatory stuff. And I think reading this section, like, I'm not an immigrant to the United States, but like the experiences that I went through, like, then, and the experiences that like my parents went through or like their parents went through in school, I think like in this section they talk about how immigrants are people who need the most social support. And so it's just like an ultimate disservice that in schools and in the rest of society that they're treated as so other and that they're like, so I think that like was a good section for us to read going into our classrooms and thinking about how do we ensure that students who are visibly different are really supported by their teachers and by their peers. Because that can really make you not want to go to school, if people are going to be making fun of you.
Yeah, there was like this part where they talk about how like teachers are within within school structures that already have like these bias and like stereotypical ideas, and how that like leaks down to the students. So like that like makes sense, and it's true. Like I went to in high school and like all of my life except college, of course, I went to schools where we were all of color. Like, I mean, in my middle school, I remember having one person who was white, and like she was removed after a while. And in high school, I had like no one there that was white. So basically, in these like schools, even though we were all people of color, we kind of found differences within ourselves. Like, even though we're all like going through like the same type of struggle when it comes to like education, like we're always trying to like find something to like, I don't know, see differences about. And that goes back to the idea where the section about like calling students within multicultural education people of color, and how this word is not even, that term is not even that great, because it like kind of like turns its back on the fact that people of color have problems within themselves, and they also don't have the same kind of history here in America and overall, like in the same cultural history. So yeah.
I think it's really interesting looking at like the different identities that we have from and the impact on students' lives. I grew up in a very urban community. I live in Tacoma, Washington. So very low income, urban, not a very huge white population. And myself, I'm African American. You can't tell looking at me. I have really light skin. My dad's Black, and so I learned a lot about identity going through about what my ethnicity was, what my race was, you know, all of these different things. And so I think it's like really cool that they made sure to say, you know, not make assumptions, because that was a huge part of my life, I felt like. And then once we talk about in sociology a lot, students who have to answer a lot of questions in class and questions that they shouldn't be. And I knew that as well, and I thought that was very interesting. How we should be just teaching all history so that there's not that one student who says, oh.
Yeah, that's like such a hard question to address. Like, how do you teach all history? Because it's like, it's almost like impossible, but it's important to at least try to do that, because yeah, yeah, obviously there's so much to improve upon, but I feel like I learn new histories all the time about our country. It would be impossible to put that into one course.
I mean, like, I don't know. It would be almost impossible, but like, I just feel like thinking back at like high school. I mean, I don't know how it is outside of like New York City public schools, but I mean, we got so much American history, and it's like after a while, it's like, okay, I got it. I got it. Like,
You can only learn about the revolution so many times.
yeah, like, and it's just like, I remember being in like AP history, American history, and like getting like really high grades, and my teachers were so like happy. I'm like, I've been learning about this like all my life. Like, what do you expect? Like,
Yeah.
it was just like, I did not have like an introduction to any other type of culture until college, where I like took Middle Eastern studies because of that, because I'm like, I want to see how we as like Westerners view others. Like I'm an other here, but like, and I already know how people view me, but like, I want to see how like our mind is constructed to like look at others. It's so strange, and I don't know. I feel like maybe like if that would be like one of like the ways to fix that, to just like, I don't know, like history is so important. Like just Latin American history, African history, I don't know, anything but American history every single year. Like,
Or like incorporating all of those histories because, you know, it, like the book said, it is American history. Every story is a part of what made America America.
right.
Stories, and we centric kind of stories, and the Irish immigrants and all of this, when there was so much more going on during that time.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But I like what you said, Lorraine, about like feeling other, makes me inquisitive sometimes about other types of otherness, if that makes sense. And even for people who are white, like that's kind of something that I'm always wondering. Like, a lot of my friends ask me is like, if I'm white, like how do I understand experiences of people who are like different from me? And I think that that's like the biggest issue. Is like how do you connect those experiences and those histories to students who aren't intrinsically like emotionally connected to it? You know what I mean? Like, of course I want to learn about like the history of the Caribbean and Latin America, but how do you interest people who aren't, you know what I mean?
Like, who don't have the same desire to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
I guess, no, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, when it comes to students, I mean, I guess that's like part of it, like just like having them have those desires. I mean, I feel like even those desires in public school systems in New York City, like they're not really expanded upon. They're just like, okay, you're going to learn about American history, and like that's all you're ever going to want to learn about. And it's just like, they never like really I feel like there's a way to like, I don't know, make students like open to that. I don't know if that's where you were going with it.
No, you're right. And it just comes down to providing that information to them, like, and then they can do with it what they want. I guess, like, it should be taught whether or not you're sure that they're going to be interested, because it's important to how they understand the world and how, if they're going to be treating other people with dignity and respect. Because ultimately, learning history is learning about people, the struggle of certain people, and so you need that context if you're going to be treating people with respect, if you know what their ancestors have been through to get to.
And it's kind of like expected that everyone's interested in American history. Why? And, okay, I'm just like...
Because nationalism, come on.
It's always like, it's white American history. Like, we don't talk about Native Americans. We don't talk about slavery in the North. Like, we don't talk about communities that, when, you know, we don't talk about how our country wouldn't be able to exist if we didn't have slavery and people working for free to build it. So it's always like the romantic, like Paul Revere's midnight ride to warn people that the British were coming, and like, yeah, that's great, but you know, there are things that are much more important that are like the dark underbelly of America's society.
Yeah, I remember like when we learned about the Trail of Tears, it was like half a second in the lesson plan, and I was like, this is a huge, like, we wiped out almost an entire group of people just because of their skin color and because they were here first and we didn't like that. And like, that is so horrific. And it was like, oh, by the way, this happened. Next slide. And I was like, really? That's it? Like,
and it doesn't talk about the continuous legacies of that.
yeah, there's never like a follow-up of like, this is what's still happening, or this is how it affected people. It was like, oh, this did happen, the end. And you're like, that, what? Like, that's not how life works. Like, people keep having to move on, and like, it doesn't talk about the trauma that they face, or like how their kids today are reacting to that, or anything like that.
Yeah. Should we move to the, because we're getting, oh no, Lorraine. Let's wait for her to come back.
Okay. I'll pause.
But now that we're talking about more like personal.
Yeah.
Okay, I hit record again.
Okay.
I'm sorry, like, my Wi-Fi, like, just left.
No, that's fine. So I read the hidden bias piece first. It was more like abstract and scientific and analytical than personal. And I like that they have concrete suggestions about combating hidden bias. I thought that was interesting. Or they're talking about like communities and but there was one part where they were talking about how integration laws have been so successful in the U.S. and I was like, what country are you living in? You know, so that I thought that they were too optimistic, but I do agree with some of the suggestions that they had. Like, I think that so, yeah.
I also, did you take the like hidden bias test that they had on that?
No, I didn't take the test.
Okay, the test was basically like, there's a man and a woman. One's a doctor, one's a nurse. Which one's which? And I was like, it could be either. And then it was like, never mind, do you think that men have to be doctors? And I was like, where did you get that? Like,
Wow.
and like, it made you like hit buttons based on like words that came up. And it was like nurse, and you were supposed to hit like the male side or the female side. And it was like, I don't want to hit either. Like, it was really hard, and like it like definitely played with your mind a little bit, but it was cool to see. But at the same time, it was like, I think you were intentionally trying to say that I am biased when like I am. I'm definitely biased just because I'm a person, but at the same time, like, I don't think I'm biased when it comes to like all men are doctors and all females are nurses. Like,
Yeah, like
It
let's
was a
have
very
discussion
concrete
about this.
Yeah.
It reminded me of this like research project I saw where they put a bunch of images it was a black man, a black woman, a white man, and a white woman, and they put them in all these different like one was like each one was dressed as a police officer, each one was dressed as all this like a doctor, a teacher, and then it was like micro flashes, so it was only enough conscious to register it, and then they like through EG writers or whatever, they registered your brain's reaction to it and whether or not you had a negative reaction to see like what you were afraid of, because then they would throw in random pictures of like the ocean or like things like that. And that's what like the part of the test I got through was the Chinese symbol test, and that's what it was reminding me of. Chinese symbol. But you saw the Chinese symbol for like maybe half a second.
That's so interesting that it relied on your brain activity instead of like what you would answer. Because I would definitely tailor my answers because I don't think I would want to like be faced with the fact that I am biased about certain things. You know, like I would try to represent myself as best I can, but I guess it's not.
It was like measuring subconscious bias, not conscious bias. So like bias that a lot of people don't even know. So it was like a really interesting study because it showed that like even African Americans who were taking the test were more fearful of the African American and like certain areas where everyone across the board was fearful of the white police officer. So it was just really interesting.
Yeah. What do you guys think about the invisible knapsack?
Oh my, I think she was so brave in writing this. Like, wow. That was so, like, I was talking to my friends about this actually. I was like, it was just like so many things you don't even think about. Like, for example, the one with if I chew with my mouth open, it's not going to say everything. It's not going to say like all Latino people chew like this. Like as a white person, it's just like, oh, she does it, he does it. So I'm like, they all do it. Yeah, that was intense.
It was so thorough. Like I thought it was only going to be one page, and then I scrolled to the second page. I was like, oh. Yeah, the part where she talked about affirmative action employers or schools, that like when I first, so I went to NYU undergrad, and all my roommates were white and from the Midwest, and I remember having a conversation where they were like, "Oh, I wish I was Hispanic because I would get into places more easily," and I was like, "Oh." What? You know, and that people say that a lot, and I'm like, well, but how about I just did well in school and I wrote a good essay to get into NYU. So yeah, and these are all like really subconscious things too, like a lot of them. So that's I think why I was so surprised that she identified them, like what you're saying about the chewing with your mouth open. Yeah, so she really, yeah, I thought it was a great list.
Yeah, it was.
White privilege conversations are always really interesting. And a lot of people don't recognize it, but then like I just thought it was having such light skin, but African American, I experienced a lot of white privilege. And whether I understood at first that that's what it was until I understood sister's experience in that school because she has the darker skin, and it's very interesting. With a lot more than just like it's
Yeah, like if you're white presenting but you're a person of color, yeah, it's interesting because I think people share with you how they feel about other cultures because they assume that you'll feel the same. So it's almost like you don't Like, I definitely don't experience as much intimidation as people who are like more visibly Hispanic, but I feel like I hear some stereotypes that people are thinking about because they don't realize that that's one of my identities.
I'm like, don't say that. I don't want to hear you say that because that's very offensive. And I have to like have that awkward conversation with them about, I know you thought you were in a place where no one was going to hear you, but surprise, that was offensive because of this. Like, it's bizarre.
Yeah. It's definitely that. And I mean, like, as we saw in that graph, like, or that chart, that our culture is becoming more and more multi-ethnic, multicultural, and so, like, people will have visible identities and non-visible identities. So, yeah, these discussions matter even more because you never know what you're shaping for
going back to the hidden bias. Sorry, I just really want to talk about this. There was this part that the whole burden of suspicion. But that's what the psychologist called Claude Steele calls, and it's basically like just knowing you're stigmatized as something, and it like just coming out that way, like your actions start to reflect that. And I just thought like that's really interesting. We've been having like a lot of conversations about like, well, me and my friends, like how all these kids who are like African American kids who are kind of like, shot down by cops because they're like running away from them. Like, is that right or wrong? Like, who's like, I mean, there's no right or wrong, but basically my friend is kind of like arguing like they shouldn't be running away, but it's just that idea like, hey, I already know you think I'm doing something wrong, like that I'm not gonna have an equal chance like to express myself. Like, I don't know, that just like was really interesting to me to see that there's actually a term for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that legitimizes your feelings.
Yeah. So.
Should we do another chat? Because we have less than a minute again.
Yeah, you can do another one. Let me stop and make another one. Sorry, it takes a couple minutes.